Hello, everyone. Welcome to session 12. Sorry, that's the wrong one. Right here we go. God disciplining his people from 1 Samuel 4. And this is when the exile or the ark winds up going into exile and the tabernacle is destroyed. But retitling this lesson, Renewal Begins in Exile. The exile I'm talking about here, of course, is not one in which Israel leaves the land. Israel remains in the land, but as it was in the days of the judges, so it's now coming to its ultimate climax here with, again, Samuel becoming the last and final of the judges before he anoints the first two kings of Israel. So this exile begins with essentially God taking himself into exile because of how these people have made it very clear they do not have any intent to follow him and continue to throw themselves after other gods. So, starting in the upper left corner with the story of Egypt here oppressing Israel, I'm going back to the original Exodus story here and using that as a backdrop by which we're painting the picture of what's going on here with Philistia and their oppression over Israel. So, in the story of the Exodus, clearly the Egyptians are the oppressors. We don't need to rehash that. But notice or appreciate here how the story of Philistia and their oppression in Israel, going back to the time of the Judges, midway through that book, with Samson coming on as the last and final judge, this is the period in which Philistia is now raised as the largest, biggest, longest running in duration oppressor over Israel since the time of the uh, Israelites' sojourn in Egypt. So, as we compare some key text here in Exodus chapter 1, we see the Egyptians oppressed the Israelites with forced labor. And we go to the account in Judges chapter 13 that the Lord has clearly handed Israel over to the Philistines for 40 years. Again, the longest period of their oppression by any particular close or surrounding nation state in the period of the Judges. The people cry out to the Lord in Exodus. God says to Moses, he hears them. He's going to come down and rescue them. Now, the whole reason why he has raised up Samson in this divine way that he has with respect to allowing his barren parents the chance to have a son, but also instructed them that they should raise him as a Nazarite from birth, is stated very clearly. The reason why is because it's through Samson that he will begin to save Israel from the Philistines. Now, what's interesting about this account, though, is that it's not because the people have chosen to turn their hearts back to the Lord. It's almost as if they've consigned themselves to this. So it's at a place now where Yahweh is choosing to work in spite of the fact that there is no outward measure of repentance on the part of the people of Israel. Now we go back to the story of the Exodus, Israel, ultimately delivered from Egypt, but we don't really have that going on here in the story of the Philistines oppressing Israel outright. Now, what I mean by that here is we have this dramatic delivery in which Yahweh shows up and he is bringing these people out of the land. And then when he does, he draws them to himself before Sinai. This happens to be after they cross the Red Sea and they're still on the way to the land, or I should say, on their way to Sinai. And this is when Yahweh promises them, after he turns water from bitter to sweet, and then he brings them down into the area of Elim where there are 12 springs of water and 70 date palm trees. And he says, if you will carefully obey the Lord your God, I will not inflict on you any of the illnesses that I inflicted on the Egyptians, because I am the Lord who heals you. Now, sadly, the Israelites have basically chosen to oppress themselves. This is how the book of Judges begins with the statement here by the angel of the Lord. They were not to make covenants with them, they were to tear down their altars, but instead they've not done that. And because they haven't obeyed, they're going to become thorns in the sides of these people. Point being is that the rest of the book of Judges on in the beginning of Samuel shows this period of time in which Israel has willfully chosen to oppress themselves by virtue of their disobedience. Now, Israel goes out into the wilderness. That's where the tabernacle is constructed, a tent where God says is where I will meet you at. That carries us over into the story here in Samuel, because in this moment, the tabernacle is destroyed. God has just had it with Israel to the point where he not only allows them to be defeated in combat when they go out to battle the Philistines, but he also allows for the ark to be taken into exile. And again, the tabernacle at Shiloh to be destroyed. Now, that's not emphatically stated in the book of First Samuel, but when we go to future accounts such as Psalm 78 or Jeremiah, where he can constantly calls their attention back to Shiloh and what the Lord did there, he allowed the Philistines to advance beyond the line of battle with the Israelites and totally decimate the tabernacle, burn it to the ground. How much of it survived, don't know. There is a tabernacle after this, but no doubt after a fair measure of it was repaired. And then many of the priests were put to the sword when the Philistines had their way with them. So the Lord allows himself to be taken into exile out of the land, going into Philistia. Again, this in some way foreshadows what will ultimately happen even after the period of the kings, that the Israelites will wind up going into exile. But it's in exile that renewal begins. While Israel is exiled and oppressed in Egypt, this is where renewal begins for them as a nation, no longer a clan that's about to be born out of exile through this exodus to come into the land. And throughout these cyclical periods of judges ruling over the people, they've slipped back into apostasy, and the Lord has chastised them again through a mini kind of exile arc where they don't really leave the land, but yet again they're under spiritual and physical house arrest in the land until God raises up a Moses-like deliverer. Now that's going to transition over to a period in which king and prophet are going to be leading the people. But until that time happens, God is going into exile to then start the renewal process there. What's interesting about his time in exile, though, is that God begins to decimate Philistines all by himself without the use of a human partner, because the ark is sat in the temple of Dagon, and of course, the temple or the statue of Dagon is ultimately destroyed because of the Ark of the Covenant being in the presence of it. And then great plagues were brought upon the people, just like it was amongst the Egyptians in Egypt. But when this happens in Philistia, only Yahweh is there, as goes the symbolism of the box of the Ark of the Covenant. None of the Israelites are. And of course, God is not bringing someone there to rescue the ark. Rather, God manipulates the circumstance through causing the suppressiveness of the people of Philistia to have them want to yearn to get rid of God, as goes getting this box out of there. So after the people of Israel are brought out of Egypt, Yahweh abides with them in exile. But the paradigm flip here in this particular story of Samuel is that Yahweh takes himself into exile. Yahweh abiding with his people in exile in the stories of Exodus and beyond, of course, to show that he is continuing this renewal, but even his presence amongst them doesn't fully affect that change, right? They continue to rebel. But my point in all of this, to just end this little vignette, is to say that as Yahweh takes himself into exile, what he's purposefully doing here is bringing about the transition by which Israel is going to be led for a period of a few decades by this titular figure, Samuel, who is going to basically be prophet, priest, and king, foreshadowing the Messiah. And then, of course, giving way to the one who will lead after him. That's ultimately David. So we'll unpack this more when we wind up getting into our workshop. Until then, thank you for tuning in, and we have one more to go.